Are there still folks that need to come in?
Okay.
All right, here comes some more folks. So welcome everybody to the Southeast District's Best Practices Call this month. I'm Kim Marks-Malone, I'm the chair-elect. Heather Beck, our current chair, couldn't be here today, so I'm going to kick things off. There's a new requirement for us to show an antitrust statement at the beginning of all of our meetings. So I wanted to put that up there for just a moment. I'm not going to read it to you all. I think you can probably skim it for yourselves. Just want to make sure that we get that up there and we show it. Everybody has a chance to look at it. Probably something familiar because I think that we have to do at the beginning of all chapter meetings and district meetings now, is my understanding. So we've got that. And I'm just going to stop sharing. I'm pretty excited for this week's call, and I'm going to turn it over to Meredith Libby you're from Nashville chapter, correct?
I am, and I'm very, very glad to be introducing today my Nashville colleague, Peter Woolfolk. He's the host of the Public Relations Review podcast, which has been named a Best Business Podcast by Carolina Business Review and a top PR podcast you must follow by Feedspot. The Public Relations Review podcast has listeners in hundreds of cities worldwide, and today Peter will share how he developed the podcasts and a few lessons learned from his more than 70 guest experts. In addition to hosting the podcast, Peter is the president of Communication Strategies based in Nashville, Tennessee. He has more than 25 years of experience in public and media relations, including in higher education, healthcare, the U.S. House of Representatives, the Clinton administration, and has additional experience in radio and television. So with that, I will turn it over to our guest speaker, Peter Woolfolk.
Well, Meredith, thank you so very much. Let me get my share screen thing going here. I guess I double click on this again just to make sure we're up and running there. Oh, share. I said, okay, I just want to get this right here. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Let me get this.
Just open your PowerPoint now down at the bottom, Peter.
Okay. All right. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Whew. Let me get this out of the way. Okay, I'm going to have right here from the beginning. Okay. Okay. First of all, thank you so very, very much for having me. I've been looking forward to this, for an opportunity to talk not only about the podcast, but also the benefits that I've accrued from it, and some of the other listeners as well. So since we're going to be talking about the podcast, let me first give you this video that I produced probably in the first quarter of last year. Some of the data is already old, but it'll give you a brief overview of the podcast, and then I can get into a bit more details. I'm going to try not to go, I've timed it roughly around 17 minutes, so if it seems that I'm speaking rather fast, it's that I don't want to take up all the time giving the presentation, because I really do look forward to having interactions with the folks who are here. So with that, here's my very brief introduction of the podcast. Hello, I'm Peter Woolfolk, host and producer of the Public Relations Review podcast. I invite you and your public relations colleagues to join me on this podcast as I invite public relations professionals from across America to discuss a wide range of topics and issues of interest to you. Our guests are from states in every part of America: North, South, East, West, Midwest, and many in-between locations. Among the many topics we have covered are crisis prevention and communications, messaging, what do millennials want in public relations, marketing to women, building trust in local governments, trends in public relations for nonprofits, and many more. Many of our guests have enjoyed the interviews and they post them online. So simply Google Public Relations Review Podcast to see some of them. In addition, data shows we have listeners in over 20 countries and growing. We have grown to the point we are carried on many of the world's largest podcast sites: Apple, Google, iHeart, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and others. So if you are a public relations professional and have an interesting topic to discuss, please contact us through your favorite platform. So please join us for the very next edition of the Public Relations Review podcast, and thank you so very much for listening.
Okay, now having done that, that by the way is on YouTube as well. How did I get from this small, and when I say a small idea, this podcast I launched in January 2019. I was the guest and the host, had an audience of 1. So how do we get from that to, as I said, worldwide? I did not intend for it to be worldwide, but it just happened. So how do we get there? Actually, and I'll bring this up because Vicki Bagley, the late Vicki Bagley, I want to say, she was a very, very important person in getting me launched in this thing. But she started the idea. She asked me, as I looked into podcasting. This was back in 2018. I said no. Some months later, I did. I liked it. And I also had a background in radio, so it made sense to me. But I said, if I'm going to start a podcast, why would I want to? What am I going to do? What's the purpose of it? And my purpose really is the space it occupies this. I want to provide information that public relations professionals can use in their daily activities. The esoteric things, I'll leave that to other people, but that's what I want to do. Provide you with information that you can use every day. So now that I said, as I said earlier, I was a guest of 1, but now I've made this commitment. Where am I going to get my guests from? What topics am I going to cover? Well, I didn't have time to just stop and think, who can I talk to next? The easiest way for me was I did nationwide searches for guests. I read PR articles and PR news. I actually threw out an invitation to PR open forum. I did internet searches in some cases where I just typed in the state and public relations and things popped up, and I found some people of interest that made a lot of sense. So that's how I really began to reach out and identify audience. There was actually a second part to this as part of how am I going to build my following. Here are a few of our guests. Michelle Garrett, you may have read her on some things. Rick Baccaroc, if you want to link your brand with some celebrities, movie stars, whatever, TV people, he's one of the people to go to. Jonathan Bernstein, I'll talk about him later because I really appreciated and love what he said. Diane Eichler, if you're familiar with PR Loop, she was a guest before they actually launched it. Garland Stansel, as I said before, is a former chair of that. If you probably heard of, obviously, Katie Delahaye Payne. So, and you see all the states they come from. These are some of the caliber of people that we have had. So now that we've had these guests, now we have to get people the availability to hear them. So you can see, as I said, we're on 30 podcast sites now, a little bit over 30. But one of the ones I really want to point to, I'm not sure, there it is right there. Here it is. As a matter of fact, I have it right here beside me. Amazon Alexa. You can actually go to Amazon Alexa now and say, Alexa, play Public Relations Review podcast, and it'll pop right up. So I'm very, very happy about that sort of thing as well. So now that we've got it, how do we go about promoting it? You've seen some of these earlier. Oops, let me go back. How do we promote this? One of the things that we did by reaching out to people around the country, we committed to giving each and every one of them a copy of the podcast. And I said, you can have the podcast, use it to your best benefit, put it online, Facebook. And as you can see, a lot of them actually did that. Michelle Garrett, this is a professor from, I think it says Temple University. Georgie is from California. Jamie is up in Kentucky. Courtney is in Maryland. And Greg, I think he is a professor at the university in West Virginia. So these are some of these 64 guests that we have had and on our show. So now here we are again, as Meredith mentioned, it shows right up here, part of the data shows that I think we have 916 cities and right now 86 countries that we've, and this is just from the Buzzsprout data that shows where we are. in terms of that. What are the listeners saying? Heather Haywood, as the president-elect of Arkansas, wrote in and said, fine, one, she appreciates the show. And we wound up making a presentation to the Arkansas chapter, I think, back in April. Listeners, here are some of the likes that we picked up. I forget which site this is from, and some Apple reviews at 5.0, some more likes that we have picked up. This one I think is very interesting. This is all podcasts, and when we say all podcasts in the USA, we're talking about this number up here, 750,000. We're 3,000 somewhere in that number, and that's too many. I don't concentrate on that one. What I do look at is business, all businesses as well. We found out that on the Apple list, they have 2,600 business podcasts. We are 479, which puts us somewhere in the top, somewhere around 30%, something along those lines. So that's really not bad for just being around for about 2.5 or so ideas. Here's some of the things that we've gotten, and these came in within the last month, from February to April. These showed up. We're one of the best podcasters in the Carolinas, both north and south. Here's one from Cision that came in, said, find great podcast that you should follow. Matter of fact, Katie Goodell Head Payne sent me a podcast that said she'd been a guest. Feedspot said, well, we're one of the top 25 podcasts. And here's another one that one of the best public relations podcasts for 2020. So that's the process we use to get to where we are now. So what did I learn from talking to all these people, 70 some odd people from around the country? Well, I've decided to look at 3 areas: crisis prevention, or an overlooked population, and diversity. So let's look at crisis prevention. Crisis prevention is, what do you do? Have you looked at what you can possibly do before you have a crisis? What could possibly go wrong in your shop? And then how are you going to prepare yourself for that? Okay, I wanted to use, okay. How are you going to prepare for that? Hacking, where do you store all of your information? Is it off-site, somewhere that you can get to it easily? How about the idea of catching on fire? Your place catches on fire. Where would your staff go the next day or the next 2 days? What arrangements are you going to make to get new equipment? Again, where have you stored all of your information? Staff. Oh boy, this could be an unusual one. Suppose some of your senior staff got caught for something like maybe drinking and driving, or something worse. Are you prepared for that? How are you going to handle that? Those kind of things do happen in large organizations. Is there a possibility of organizational silos where people really aren't communicating with each other, and maybe there's some duplication of effort, or some things are being done the wrong way? The last one here is there a system, an internal system set up so that people who see things that are going wrong, could possibly have problems, are not afraid to say so? In other words, this is not one of the things I'm going to report to my supervisor. No, You want to have somebody that has the opportunity to send information directly to your top official anonymously, because if there is a problem and if there's an opportunity for them to speak up, then they can help prevent that problem. But that system really needs to be in place. So it's crisis prevention, and then you have a better way of beginning to develop your crisis communications plan. But that's something that I think and did learn that more people and organizations really need to do. People with disabilities. Look at this population. CDC says that 1 in 4 adults has a disability, and they're growing with age. So when you talk about disabilities, whatever program you're going to work for disabilities, one size does not fit all. That is the so-called the largest minority group in the world, 64 million adults. And it's simple. Most businesses do not understand the disabled market because it too is segmented. Who are you talking about? Those bound in wheelchairs, the blind, other sort of things like that. What a lot of people in the disability community say, let's look for similarities rather than differences. But when you look at them as a market, look at this. Disabled disposable income for organizations, 490 billion, compared to African Americans 501 and Hispanics 582. They are in the same rough ballpark. Discretionary income, 220 billion. African Americans 3 billion, Hispanics 16 billion. That is a lot of money that PR and marketing firms need to be able to get to, but you need to make sure that you develop marketing plans to reach these people. I did a show that's focused strictly on marketing to the blind. I just stumbled into it. A professor had written a paper. A professor, as a matter of fact, the guy with him was a blind guy working for Microsoft. So there are, if you want to say it, opportunities, but you have to work for them, understand the group, and then go about planning accordingly for the specific group that you want to reach. Diversity. The first part, let me just talk about the Hispanic marketing, because yes, it's a huge market, the largest minority group right now in the country. And you need to do it the right way. I mean, people are still making mistakes. One of the first things, and this is from a guy I talked to out in Portland, Oregon, who runs a big Hispanic PR firm out there. I've got a lot of information from him. Understanding the cultural differences. When you talk about Hispanics, you're talking about a wide diversity. Are the people from Mexico? Are they from Puerto Rico? Are they from Cuba? Are they from Honduras? You've got to understand that difference, because there are cultural differences there. And again, this is where one size does not fit all. Families. Families are very, very important in the Hispanic community. I remember doing a program here for the mayor a couple of years ago. He wanted us to do a program to help celebrate the opening of the conventions at Nashville's Convention Center. We did one for the general population, and if things went so well, he said, well, let's do one for the Hispanic population. Well, I'm not smart enough to know all those kinds of things about the Hispanic population, but I am smart enough to know that I need to go somewhere to find out. So we went to the major Hispanic community center here. And when we told them what we wanted to do to have this event, the very first thing they said was, it has to be on a Saturday. Why? Because they're going to want to bring all the family members there. So that is hugely important. Relationships. If you've got somebody that's in the Hispanic community, or if you don't have somebody in Hispanic, you need to form some relationships so that you can fully understand how to penetrate this market. This is an article I wrote back in the Nashville Business Journal some years ago, and it really talks about the benefits of diversity. And I'm saying I made this, wrote this article from a business perspective. And it shows, and it says down here, I think this is important. In 2003, PepsiCo said about 250 million of its revenue growth from that particular year before came from new products inspired by the creative input from its diverse audience. That says a lot. What that says to me is, if you tell people we're going to diversify, and the reason for that is it gives a solid business background to that, and they really begin to pay attention to that. So this is pretty much sort of interwoven, that penetrating the Hispanic market, there's a reason for that, is that you're going to better know how to penetrate that market, what works, does not work, and how to do it successfully. Diversity. These are some stumbling blocks, and the stumbling block came from an article I read, I think, in Public Relations Today. A young lady who, I guess she'd been out of college for maybe about 3 or so ideas, and it was, what are some of the stumbling blocks to diversifying? So let me where's my little arrow here. The top 3 here are devoted to primarily in the beginning, kids coming out of college. Go to the source. Too often we have large events where, here's a diversity event. You guys come down and sit down and talk to us, and so forth and so on. So we can, maybe bring you on board. Well, why don't you go to where the people are that you're looking for? If you're going to talk about African American, particularly students, why don't you go to some of the HBCUs? Better still, why doesn't PRSA have a meeting with the council of HBCU college presidents? Because one thing I learned from being in Congress, if you want to get things done, go to the top. The other thing is, and I learned this also, I had some personal experience with this when I worked at the Department of Education for assistant secretary. We wanted to bring on interns. Unfortunately, we couldn't pay them. you need to end non-paid internships, because I was not able to bring on any African-American student because they needed to be paid. They just didn't have the wherewithal to work free. It was a great thing because having on your resume working for the Assistant Secretary of Education, as compared to maybe that, I worked at McDonald's, there's nothing wrong with working at McDonald's, but if you want to make a greater impact, our job would have been better, but unfortunately, students couldn't afford to do that. Look outside the box. There are people who are now in public relations who did not study public relations. Perhaps you might know that a lot of people you see on TV and other places have other backgrounds, but they, for whatever reason, they decided to come into public relations, and it has worked well for them. Something else I firmly believe in and has also said is this: if you're going to have a diversity program and you want it to work well, support for that program must come from the top, the president, the chairman, whoever the person is. That's where people will know it's got to be taken seriously. If you started in the HR department, okay, a lot of people might say that this is a nice, warm, fuzzy thing to do. But if you wanted to make it work well, have it start at the top, so that's endorsed by folks like that. One of the other things is that if you're going to have it, and depending upon the size of the organization, have diversity KPIs included in their performance measurements. That's the way, when people know that they're being judged by how well they perform at their diversity program, things get done. This gets back to the next one, with a little arrow here. Okay, the benefits, as I said, of diversity. We're going to have our diversity program because the benefits of that program are A, B, C, and D. People can get their hands around that. Yes, it's a nice, warm, fuzzy thing to say, it's the right thing to do. But if you're going to have somebody on your staff, they need to be able to do something, to produce something to benefit the community or the organization at large. The other one that I ran into is having a diversity program and having people of different backgrounds on staff is certainly the right idea, but perhaps who they're reporting to, that might not be the right person. But sometimes, those things just don't work out. And it's not that anybody's not necessarily doing anything wrong, but the person who they're reporting to might not have an interest in this program. So somehow or another, that really has to be worked out. I know I'm talking kind of fast. I just want to make sure I want to get involved in our interaction here, because I really like that piece of it. But those are the three areas that I paid really a lot of attention to. I've learned a lot of things in having that podcast, but these are the three things that sort of got my attention. So I want to say, again, thank you for the invitation. And ready for questions now.
I actually have one. This is Meredith again. I don't know if you want them through the chat or just people unmuting, but my question is, I mentioned I'm a regular listener. Who are some upcoming guests we can look forward to? And also, we're all in PR. Are there, I'm wondering if anybody on the call might be a potential guest for you. So I guess two questions. What do you look for in a potential guest? And who's next up?
Well, for potential guests, I really want to talk about a specific topic. For instance, as I said, when I'm looking for a guest, right now I Google people. I don't Google people, I Google areas. Give you an example. There are certain states, because I wanted to talk to people from practically every state. But there's some states, like Montana, for instance. So I Google Montana public relations, and I go up and down what I see on Google, and do I see anything worthwhile? And I saw this thing, public and media relations for law enforcement. I said, whoops, that's a scare area I never talked about. So I tracked down who it was that called them up and said, would you like to be on the podcast? And that we got it done. And again, like I mentioned to you, Heather, the president-elect at Arkansas, sent me that notice and says, hey, I think talking about your podcast and how can people benefit from that would be a good idea for shows. So I not only presented to them, but I also have asked her to help me find somebody from Arkansas with a good story to tell. So, but to answer your question, the very next person that I'm looking to have, I've got a guy who since sent me a note. He's in Alabama. He has what do you call them? The monitoring service, a media monitoring service. So once in a while, I do talk to a vendor. So how can people benefit from the monitoring service? What are the pros and cons? What are you looking for? How do you keep them? How do you, all those kinds of things about monitoring. I talked to another lady out in Iowa, and we chatted briefly, and she says that what she does, one of her big areas is that she helps clients with public policy. Yes, it's public relations, but maybe that's more public affairs, but she is a PR firm. So if perhaps there's some legislation that they either want to introduce or have some input to or fight against, she helps them craft that message and the policies and procedures. How do you go about that? Because when I worked on Capitol Hill, I see both sides, for 5 years, I've seen exactly how that works. So that's how I go about finding guests. People, pitch, it's like pitching. Sometimes, and I've had one or two, that there are podcast bureaus, so to speak, that they'll call you up and pitch their clients to be on your podcast. So I've done maybe one or two of those. I don't like that too much because I have to either accept what they give me if I think it's going to fit what my space is. So I don't deal with that too much. My next guest, quite honestly, is going to be a lady right here in Nashville, because I wanted to do something about pitching the media. And when I say pitching the media, for me, there's a difference between pitching the television media and the print media. So I've got a TV lady who's been in for 15 years. I want her to talk about what are some of the biggest mistakes she has seen people make when they pitch her, and then what would she like to see to make the pitch acceptable to her, to what she's doing. So there's a distinction, and you probably know this, maybe pitching the print media. The broadcast media needs a whole lot more, and they don't have a lot of time to do their story. They'll show up and, that story might air. You might get, a minute or a minute and a half on that story, or two, or whatever like that, where as a print reporter will sit down with you for a half hour or something along those lines. So how do you construct the pitch between print and, let's say, broadcast, particularly TV broadcast? So those, as a matter of fact, the next one I really want to get, because it's so far away, I've talked to a guy in Hawaii. That is, he's the president of a Japanese American PR firm. They've been over there for 30-odd years. Wow, I've never had that before. So I talked to him, and I wanted to make sure we got that time thing right, because there's a huge difference there. But he's agreed to do it. So now it's a matter of just catching up with him again, scheduling what it is we're going to talk about. So actually, I'll come up with an idea. I'll give you another one, and then I'll open it up again back around October. Because I had been involved in a presidential campaign, that I realized as a result of that, how much faster I rose in this business. From the presidential campaign, I was communications director for an assistant secretary of education. Well, that just does not happen. But the fact is that when you have that experience, you really catapult yourself. I mean, if you look at people who've been in whatever presidential campaign you've been in, where those people land. Well, I decided to do a story do a podcast about that before the election, and it was during the election time frame. How did this experience help me and these other people to elevate ourselves to where we are now? And as a matter of fact, I put a notice out on the open forum in PRSA. I found out it's a very small audience, and I wound up having two other guests. As a matter of fact, a lady from South Carolina who worked for, I think it was Newt Gingrich, and a guy who at the time was in Texas, who ran the communications for Ross Perot when he ran for president way back then. So it wasn't about politics, it was about experiences, what you have to know how to do or learn how to do in a presidential campaign. There's a lot of stuff, it's compact, it is fast, and it's complex. For example, I had the vice president come, I was up in Delaware. When you got the vice president coming, you've got to deal with not only the Secret Service, but also the advance team. How many people? Where are they coming? Here, what are we going to use? How are we going to get there? All those other kinds of things. The Secret Service comes in, the dog's got to be snooping. What are you going to say? Who's going to be the guest? A background check on the guest, all that sort of stuff. And that's just for that particular time period. So I'm open to pitches about that. So I mentioned those two guests. I said the monitoring service and the TV reporter are the very next two. So I try to do 2 a month. So I've got a lot of months ahead of me that I'm going to need some guests. So I'm open to a good solid pitch that fits into that space.
So it's
Who's next to
currently,
have?
it's currently 1:30, but if Peter's willing to stick around and anyone else wants to stick around and ask a question or two, I know Peter, in the chat, Natasha had asked, why do you think your podcast has become so popular?
Well, as I said once before, when I thought about what would I want to get from this podcast, in other words, I can list it. I mean, a lot of people do esoteric stuff. What is the fate of public relations during a pandemic, and what is it going to look like, in 2022? That's fine for them. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to provide people with information. As a matter of fact, I think even Meredith said that she heard something in one of the podcasts that she can use in her practice. Because a lot of people might have the same problem, but they might approach it different ways. Or hey, maybe this is something I hadn't thought of before. So that's what I do. I try to give something that you can use every day at some point. You might not need crisis prevention information all the time. Maybe you work at a nonprofit and you want to hire a PR firm. So I had a guy who does that. I said, well, what should a person in a nonprofit organization look for in selecting a PR firm to work for a nonprofit? So now you know how to go about, what do you look for? What kind of questions should you ask? What kind of background should they have? Those kinds of things. But the bottom line is, I think it's popular because people can use the information that I give to, or my guests give to them.
Great, thank you. Well, Peter, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. I encourage everyone to go check out the podcast if you haven't already. I've got some episodes downloaded to listen to later. And if you are thinking about the next best practice call, June 9th will be our next call. And we will be sending out reminders and some notes on what the topic's going to be for that call in the very near future. So thank you all for joining us. And we'll post the recording later if you want to share it with anybody in your chapter. Thanks.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.